Shalom and welcome. This video will cover the timeline of events starting with Shem leading up to the Israelites. Let's begin. Starting with the global flood, it would have to happen before the Mesolithic and the Neolithic because the Mesolithic and the Neolithic are important periods in human development that lead up to the Bronze Age. Therefore, there are three periods in which a global flood could have occurred. If you believe in an old Earth, then the flood could have occurred around 100,000 years ago. According to the paper titled Massive Genetic Study Reveals 90% of Earth's Animals Appeared at the Same Time, the paper details how 90% of all animals on the Earth appeared right around the same time. 9 out of 10 animal species on the planet came into being at the same time as humans did 100,000 years ago. The paper even states a likely possibility is the occurrence of a sudden event that caused large-scale environmental trauma and wiped out majority of Earth's species. This could most definitely possibly be the global flood, and it would have occurred 100,000 years ago if you believe in an old Earth. However, if you believe the Earth isn't too old or too young, but in the middle, my median Earth model has the flood occurring around 20,000 years ago. The aftermath of the flood would be the last glacial maximum, which was roughly around 20,000 years ago. The reason why the last glacial maximum is important is because after the global flood, it would have caused an ice age. According to PhD Walt Brown, Dr. Larry Vetterman, and Michael J. O'Rourke. Now, if you believe in a young Earth, the best date I can offer for the global flood is around 12,900 years ago, because around this time was the younger Darius, which was an ice age event. With that being said, two key events that we're looking for in a global flood is 1. A mass extinction event of animals, humans, and plant life, and 2. An ice age which would have occurred after the global flood. Now let's remove dates and focus on the aftermath of the flood. After the global flood, the ark would have rested in Mount Judy. According to Jewish, Babylonian, Syriac, Islamic, and early Christian traditions, mankind would disperse throughout the world from the Middle East. The common ancestral lineage y-DNA Adam is suggested to have originated somewhere in the Middle East or the Iranian Plateau. According to the paper titled The Reversal of Human Phylogeny, Homo left Africa as Erectus, came back as Sapien sapien. The out of Asia model for humanity represented in this paper would represent humanity coming off the ark which rested in Asia, and humanity would disperse from Asia throughout the world. Shem, son of Noah, would have migrated and settled the Levant. With all of that being said, removing the dates and focusing on the aftermath of the flood, in all of my timeline models, these periods remain, the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, because the Mesolithic and the Neolithic are important Stone Age periods in human development. After a global flood, there would have been a Stone Age. Remember, humanity is starting from scratch. The very first tools and weapons people will be using is stone. This is why understanding who Shem's Stone Age descendants are is important. What Stone Age population can best represent the descendants of Shem, and also the ancestors of Semitic populations? The Stone Age population that can best represent the descendants of Shem after the flood are the Cambrian Natufians in the Levant. According to the paper Materials and Language, Pre-Semitic Root Structure Change, Concomitant with Transition to Agriculture. This paper illustrates that the Proto-Semitic lexicon and roots of Semitic languages descend from Stone Age and agricultural populations in the Levant, namely the Cambrian culture and the Natufians. From these ancestral Semitic or pre-Proto-Semitic populations will come Proto-Semites. According to the book In Hot Pursuit of Language in Prehistory and Transition to Modernity, Natufians are the ancestors of Semites. According to the paper Genetics, Egypt, and History Interpreting Geographical Patterns of Y chromosome Variation, ancestral Semites, pre-Proto-Semites, carried haplogroup E. Natufians and Neolithic Levantines carried haplogroup E according to many papers, such as The Genetic Structure of the World's First Farmers and Placing Ancient DNA Sequences into reference phylogenies. This all means that the ancestors of Semites carried haplogroup E. And it's not just me saying this, various scientists say this as well, such as Godfrey C. and Peter Solomon Kovacs. With that being said, from the Natufians will come the Horifians. The Horifians correspond to the latest stages of the Natufian culture. According to the book titled Early Pastoral Nomadicism and the Settlements of Lower Mesopotamia, the Horifians may have been the original culture which spread Proto-Semitic language throughout the region. This complex may have developed from the fusion of Horifian and pre-Pottery Neolithic B cultures in southern Palestine. With that being said, Semites would have dispersed from the Levant in the early Bronze Age into Mesopotamia and Arabia around 3750 BC. According to the paper titled Bayesian Phylogenetic Analysis of Semitic Languages Identifies an Early Bronze Age Origin of Semitic in the Near East, around this time in the early Bronze Age, as Semites were expanding from the Levant into Mesopotamia and Arabia, is likely when Abraham's ancestors left the Levant. I would say that this would have occurred around the time of Peleg, since his name means division. This could represent dispersal and migration. Peleg also had a brother named Joktan. His descendants lived from Mesha, which is in the Levant, to Sephar, which is in southern Arabia. Joktan descendants essentially settled Arabia, and according to Arab traditions, are the original Arabians. This fits perfectly with the notion that Semites were dispersing from the Levant into Arabia in the early Bronze Age. Therefore, I place Peleg and Joktan in the early Bronze Age, as Semites dispersed from the Levant. Joktan descendants would have went to Arabia, and Peleg's descendants would have went to Mesopotamia. And in both locations, they would have been carrying the E marker. Now let's cover Abraham's genotype and phenotype. Abraham would have likely carried haplogroup E. Haplogroup E is considered to be Proto-Semitic and Proto-Afroasiatic, according to many articles and papers such as EUpedia, Haplogroup E1b1b, and How Eurasia Was Born. With Abraham carrying haplogroup E and descending from Natufians and being an Afroasiatic Semite in the Bronze Age, Middle East, it's highly likely that Abraham and his family would have had high amounts of Natufian autosomal DNA. First of all, Natufians are the ancestors of Afroasiatic populations, according to various papers such as The Prehistory of Dispersal, the Proto-Afrosan Afroasiatic Forming Lexicon, and The Prehistory of Language from the Perspective of the Y Chromosome. Proto-Afroasiatics would have carried haplogroup E, according to various papers such as Y Chromosome E haplogroups, their distribution and implication to the origin of Afroasiatic languages and pastoralism, and the origins of Afroasiatics. Most Afroasiatic populations share a close genetic distance to Natufians. These same Afroasiatic populations carry high amounts of haplogroup E. As a matter of fact, if you look at a map of Afroasiatic populations, Natufian DNA and ancestry, and haplogroup E, it all matches up perfectly. I believe Abraham would have been genetically typically Afroasiatic, carrying haplogroup E and Natufian DNA. As a matter of fact, you can take this even further. The people with the closest genetic distance to Natufians are Yemeni, Arabians, and Bedouins. These populations are genetically the most Natufian according to their autosomal DNA. Yemeni, Arabians, and Bedouins would be Joktanites, who are the closest ethnic cousins to Abraham through the lineage of Eber. If modern Yemeni, Arabian, and Bedouin populations can have high amounts of Natufian DNA, added with the modern Jewish populations such as Moroccan, Libyan, Tunisian, Iranian, and Iraqi, and Yemenis who can have upwards to 50 and more Natufian DNA, as well as other Semitic populations in the Middle East, then Abraham also would have high amounts of Natufian DNA. As a matter of fact, Levant Bronze Age populations carried upwards to 63% of Natufian DNA. Abraham being in the Bronze Age likely carried that or even more, considering that his family married other family members, which would have kept the gene pool relatively pure and close to their ancestral Semitic population, which is Natufian. Because of all these reasons, Abraham and his family also likely looked Natufian, and the Natufians looked like Africans, according to the book An Introduction to African Civilization and the genetic paper titled The Questionable Contribution of the Neolithic and the Bronze Age to European Craniofacial Form. What's interesting about the morphology of the Natufians and the fact that Natufians are supposed to be the ancestors of Semites is that, according to various anthropologists and biologists, the remains of Semites in Mesopotamia also looked African, according to books such as Report on Human Remains Found at Kish and The Contribution to the Anthropology of Iran. It's not surprising why biologists say Semites looked African according to their remains once you look at the way Semites depicted themselves or how others depicted Semites. Clearly, they are a dark-skinned people with medium brown skin to dark brown, even black, with dark brown eyes and black hair. Abraham could have easily looked like these Semites depicted. But this also isn't entirely surprising, since Jewish, Christian, and Muslim sources state that Shem's descendants look like such. According to Rabbi Eliezer, Persian historian Tabri, Muslim historian Ibn Abbas, Christian Bar Hebraicus, Shem's descendants range from light brown to black in complexion. They also applied these same skin tones to Ham's descendants as well. Basically, both Shem and Ham's descendants had similar skin tones. But if we were to take the most scientific approach, we can just look at the Natufians as a reference since they are the ancestors of Semites. And then we can look at Jokhtanites, who are Southern Arabians. And again, Yemeni have the highest Natufian DNA. Looking at Natufians and Southern Arabians is like looking at Proto-Semites. Furthermore, South Arabians have been described as looking like Somalis, Dravidians, Abyssinians, etc., according to the book The Arabs by Bertram Thomas and Ancient and Modern Man in Southwestern Asia by Henry Field. Also, Anthropological Observations in South Arabia, among many others. Therefore, I would say that Abraham would have looked like this man, dark-skinned, specifically medium brown, with a reddish undertone, dark eyes and hair. Overall, Abraham and his family was phenotypically and genetically like all other typical Afro-Asiatic populations. I don't see why he would be any different. Therefore, Abraham and his family would have carried haplogroup E, Natufian DNA, and were likely brown-skinned. Now that we have an understanding of Abraham and his family's genotype and phenotype, we can now move to the story and life of Abraham. Abraham likely lived in the Middle Bronze Age in the 3rd millennium BC, or the 2nd millennium BC. Again, Peleg and Joktan likely lived around the time of the late Chalcolithic and early Bronze Age, when Proto-Semites expanded from the Levant into Mesopotamia and Arabia. Therefore, the period Abraham likely was born in and lived in would have been around the Middle Bronze Age. The specific time period in which Abraham could have been born and lived in was around 21,000 BC to 1900 BC. With that being said, the date I would stick closest to is around 2000 BC for the life of Abraham in the Middle Bronze Age of the 2nd millennium BC.
The fact that there is some debate around the chronology of when Abraham lived. And some people take a literal approach, and if you do that, then you would say that Abraham was born about 2166. In that case, then he would have been born in the Intermediate Bronze Age, but lived most of his life in the Middle Bronze Age. And then there are other scholars, even Christian scholars, who interpret the numbers, the ages, in honorific ways, and so they would place his date a little later. So the list is made up of things that, for the most part, both groups would likely agree on.
Abraham, by our best reckoning, was born around the year 1951 BC. So, Abraham is born at a time when he's kind of in the shadow of the former glory of Ur, but the immediate circumstances of his life are a time in which things are really devolving into a certain degree of decentralized and somewhat chaotic life. We know from other sources that migration from Mesopotamia at this time was quite common, that lots of people were leaving Mesopotamia because of the instability that had set in. When we hear in the scriptures that along the way, Terah, the father of Abraham, and his family migrated away, we're not surprised because all kinds of people were doing that. It was almost the spirit of the age to go and find greener pastures, as it were. So we have Abram born into this situation, which is a little bit topsy-turvy, and we'll see a little bit more of his life in a moment.
Now that we have an understanding for when Abraham could have lived, let's dive into the life and story of Abraham. We begin in Genesis chapter 9, verse 27 through 32. Abram's father is Terah. Abram's brother are Nahor and Haran. Haran had children named Lot, Milcah, and Ishkah. Abram had a wife named Sarah. Sarah was Abraham's half-sister through Terah. Nahor had a wife named Milcah. Milcah was the daughter of Haran. Haran died in the land of Ur the Chaldees. Now, as far as we understand, Abraham's land of nativity was Ur the Chaldeans. There are two main options for which Ur Abraham was from. There's an Ur in southern Mesopotamia, and then there's an Ur in southern Anatolia.
Two different sites, northern Ur and southern Ur. Which one is it? Mark Wilson, who wrote the book Biblical Turkey, points out that a previous generation of scholars all thought it was the northern Turkey, the northern Ur in Turkey. And then in 1927, when Leonard Woolley excavated in Iraq and found the great cemetery at Ur, he described the finds as worthy of Abraham. And so the next generation of scholars thought that it was the southern site. And as I've looked at it, I think that there are some good reasons to believe that perhaps the earlier generation had it right, that it might have been the northern Ur. A couple of things. Number one, some of the ancient writers suggest that the Chaldeans, Ur of the Chaldeans actually came from Anatolia and Turkey and migrated south to Mesopotamia at some time. But remember also when Abraham sent his servant to find a wife for his son Isaac, he said, go to my own country, to my own relatives in Genesis 24. And where did the servant go? He didn't go all the way back to Mesopotamia. What he did was he went to Haran, which is located 24 miles just south of the northern city of Ur. And unfortunately, that site is covered with a city of about 2 million people today. But I would suggest that the city of Ur, the northern city of Ur, is a good place to start with number 10.
You want to jump in a plane with me and go on a little trip to Iraq? We can tour around southern Mesopotamia, and if we came to Ur, this is what we would see. It still is pretty well preserved, considering how ancient it is. We still find a lot of evidence of the civilization that was once there that would date clear back to the time of Abraham. That building that you see off in the distance there is the ziggurat that we've seen in other photos in prior weeks. It's the dominant structure in that region, but you can see a whole lot of other evidence of a civilized location if we were to visit there today. The trip that Abraham made was, of course, with his father. It seems that this would have been about 1917 BC, when Abraham is probably about between 30 and 40 years old. The last part of Genesis 11 tells us that it was Terah who packed up his family and left Ur. It seems as if he was the patriarch at that point, the father of Abraham, and hauled everybody off to go to greener pastures. And they went to a city called Haran, Haran. It looks like Haran. It's usually pronounced Haran. You have to kind of growl the H there. This was a major trading point. You can tell from the way the map is laid out that there would have been a great deal of trade coming from the north and from the south, from all points. They sort of met in this region. So at that time, it was quite a well-known location.
Both locations of Ur have good evidence supporting it. Abraham could have came from Ur in southern Mesopotamia or Ur in northern Mesopotamia. Either location doesn't drastically change the story in the Torah. With that being said, let's now begin the story and lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, starting in Genesis chapter 12 to 50.
And God's promise to Abraham at the beginning of chapter 12 opens up a whole new movement in the story. God calls Abraham to leave his home and go to the land of Canaan, which God says will become his one day. And in that land, God promises to make Abraham into a great nation, to make his name great, and to bless him. Now, these promises are connected back to earlier parts of the book. So Babylon had arrogantly tried to make a great name for itself, and that didn't go over very well. But God, in his generosity, is going to bestow a great name on this no-name guy, Abraham. And God's blessing of Abraham echoes all the way back to that original blessing God gave humanity in the beginning. So the question is, why is God going to bless Abraham and his family? And the last line of God's promise makes this clear. So that all the families of the earth will find God's blessing in you. Now, this is key for understanding the whole rest of the biblical story. God's plan is to rescue and bless his rebellious world through Abraham's family. And this is why the whole rest of the Old Testament story is just going to focus on this one family, eventually called the people of Israel. This is also why Israel will later be called a kingdom of priests at Mount Sinai. God wants to use them to show all of the other nations what he's like. And ultimately, this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets and poets who say that its fulfillment will come through Israel's messianic king, whose reign will bring justice and peace to all of the nations. Now, at this point of the story, none of that's clear. You just have to keep reading and watch the promise develop. And so the rest of the book focuses on Abraham and his family. First, Abraham himself, then his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob, and then Jacob's 12 sons. And the stories about each generation, they're united by two main themes. So first, each generation of Abraham's family is marked by repeated failure. They just keep making really bad decisions that mess up their lives and that put God's promise in jeopardy. However, God remains faithful to them. He keeps rescuing them from themselves and reaffirming his commitment to bless them and bless the nations through them despite their failings. So the Abraham stories. God had promised Abraham a huge family, but on two different occasions, he's afraid for his life because other men are attracted to his wife, and so he denies that he's even married to her, which creates, of course, all of these problems. And not only that, Abraham and his wife Sarah, they can't have children, and so Sarah arranges for Abraham to sleep with one of their servant girls, which also creates all of these problems in the family. But each time, God bails Abraham out. And in chapters 15 and 17, God even formalizes his promise to Abraham with an official commitment called a covenant. This is a classic scene. God invites Abraham to look up at the night stars and to count them. And he says, that's how numerous your family's going to be. And despite all of the odds, having no kids and no way to have any at the moment, Abraham looks up in the sky and simply trusts God's promise. And God responds by entering into a covenant with Abraham, promising that he will become a father of many nations, that God's blessing may come to the whole world. God asked Abraham to mark his family with a sign of the covenant, circumcision of all the male boys in the family. This is a symbol to remind them that the fruitfulness of their family is a gift from God. And so Abraham has lots of kids eventually, and he dies at a good old age. Now, the Jacob stories play out these themes even more dramatically. From birth, Jacob lives up to the meaning of his name, which is deceiver. He cheats his brother Esau out of his inheritance and blessing, and he does it by deceiving his old blind father, no less, and then he just takes off. He goes on to take 4 wives, even though he really only loves one, Rachel, and this creates all of these rivalries in the family. The only thing that humbles Jacob is being deceived by his uncle Laban, who cheats him out of years of his life. The tables have finally turned. And so it's a humbled Jacob that returns to his homeland. And in a very strange story, Jacob ends up wrestling with God as he demands that God bless him. Some things never really change, do they? However, God honors his determination, and he passes Abraham's blessing on to him. And he renames Jacob as Israel, which means wrestles with God.
Now that we have an understanding of the biblical story from Shem to Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, we can now begin our journey properly to the Israelites. Everything that we've covered in the past has led us to this moment. Our goal now, and has always been, to unearth the genotype and phenotype of the ancient Hebrews of Israel, and who might their descendants be today. So join me on this journey as we begin with Joseph. Be blessed and Shalom.